On the podcast today, we are taking a trip down memory lane. This week marks a number of political anniversaries. The 40th anniversary of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which gave the Republic a say in the affairs of Northern Ireland for the first time ever. Then we also have 10 years since Colin Eastwood ousted Alistair MacDonald as the SDLP leader. And it's also 10 years since Peter Robinson announced he was standing down as leader of the DUP. We have two people who had a front row seat to two of three of these events, and we'll be debating what happened and what was the long-term impact of this important week in politics all that long time ago. All that and more coming up on this edition of Stormont Sources. Okay, it's been remarked and noted upon that this month, it was the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. This agreement was signed by Taoiseach Garth Fitzgerald and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, the Anglo-Irish Agreement did provoke some of the more memorable images in our history. Of course, we had the pictures of Garth Fitzgerald and Margaret Thatcher shaking hands at Hillsborough, where they signed the agreement. And then, of course, the visual unionist opposition to it. We had the big rally in Belfast City Centre where we had Ian Paisley giving one of his most famous speeches. Jim Molyneux was actually the leader of unionism at that point, but no one remembers his remarks. They always remember Ian Paisley's, which was the famous never, never, never speech. I'm going to kick off first with you, Timothy. Did you go to that rally, by the way, in the city centre? And what were your memories of the Anglo-Irish Agreement and your views of it?
I was there on the 23rd of November 1985. I paraded in from East Belfast.
By choice, or were you forced? As an 11-year-old?
Oh, gracious, no. By choice. I don't want to sort of spill the beans of what sort of 11-year-old I was, but I was an 11-year-old who was running elections, amongst my family and making my grandparents, make speeches and this kind of thing. And my grandmother, she was from Cavan. Don't want to bore people with her history too much, but she was sent up from Cavan to Northern Ireland just after partition to live with a relative in Donaghadee, and she was an avowed unionist. I mean, there was no one I've ever met was a stronger unionist than her, even though she retained her Republic of Ireland accent throughout her life. And she was a staunch DUP member and a staunch member of the Free Presbyterian Church, Sandown Road Free Presbyterian Church.
An excellent mix.
That's right. So she was very political, and we obviously took our politics, and I certainly took my interest in politics from her. And I mean, I was an 11-year-old, was absolutely outraged at this betrayal of the unionist people, and that's what it was, of course, a betrayal of the unionist people. And as an 11-year-old, my grandmother was parading, and my parents were also there. But for some reason, I don't know why my mum and dad couldn't be bothered walking in. I don't know. I think they got a bus or something. I remember walking in with my grandmother. I remember vividly. Don't remember a lot about it, to be honest. I do remember there was scaffolding up on the what was the Wimpy? What's Burger King now, and there were people up in the scaffolding. I remember feeling quite crushed and couldn't really see very much. I mean, it's disputed as to how many people were there. I mean, the unionist parties claim 500,000 were there. I mean, official figures say over 100,000. Most estimates say somewhere between 100 and 200,000. But it was packed.
It was huge. Yeah.
It was packed. It was huge. I mean, right the way down Royal Avenue, both sides of the city hall, completely and utterly filled. I don't know if it was happening today, what happened to the Christmas market, but I mean, it was completely and utterly packed. And I don't remember a lot of the speech, but I do remember. Well, memory's an odd thing, isn't it? Do I remember seeing it on TV, or do I remember it standing there? But whichever way, I mean, the Paisley never, 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 and he says it 4 times. I think most people says he says it 3, but he says it a sort of 4th time quite quietly. And I remember, the crowd being very, very agitated. I don't know what, roused, whatever the proper word is at that time. And I remember as an 11-year-old thinking, we're going to bring this agreement down. We're going to stop this. And of course, that isn't where protest ended. I mean, there was the Ulster Says Stop weekend, which was the end of March in 1986. And then there was another protest back at City Hall, which I was also at in 1986. And that Ulster Says Stop, that day of action, which is going to replicate the strikes in 1974. And it really did. Certainly, we were off school. And I remember me and my brother on our bikes going round, Stormont and various other places, watching people on the picket lines and thinking, this was great. Like, I mean, there was real action happening, and, we were going to be part, of stopping whatever it was going on, whatever treachery was afoot at that time. And certainly, as a young unionist in my formative years, I mean, I just remember it being a time where there was a great sense of fear as to what was happening in the country. There's a great sense of, what would the British government plan at, and a great sense of, this agreement must be defeated and must be brought down.
Michael, what were your memories of that? So you're based in Dublin at this time.
Yes.
But I'm saying, as a Northern nationalist, I mean, for most nationalists, it was seen as a positive thing.
Oh, very much so. Just by way of background, I mean, I was based in the Department of Finance in Dublin, in government buildings there in Upper Marion Street, the Department of Taoiseach next door, Garrett Fitzgerald just around the corner. There was growing excitement among civil servants in Dublin at the time that something was brewing. This was after Margaret Thatcher had very harshly rejected the recommendations of the All-Ireland Forum with their famous out press conference, which Garrett Fitzgerald described as gratuitously offensive. And people thought that that's the end of this jointry, but far from it. Mrs. Thatcher was looking for a solution. I was at a conference recently at Queen's there to mark this 40th anniversary, and Dick Spring was there, then Taoiseach, 35 years old, and he said that there was a general understanding between London and Dublin that with the escalating violence in the north, and we were, if you remember, people were starting to get killed in minibuses and in pubs and groups, and it was getting worse. And so there's a general feeling that something had to be done, as Dick Spring said. The South went into the negotiations with very little in their hand to play. But Margaret Thatcher thought there would be a security dividend if they found some sort of agreement with Dublin. So she maybe went into it and had been kind of briefed a little generously by her officials. But when it was signed, it could only be regarded as a diplomatic triumph for the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and the Taoiseach, Garrett Fitzgerald. Haughey had broken decades of non-contact with London by arriving a couple of years before with a teapot for Mrs. Thatcher, which apparently went down quite well. But it was when he and Lenihan came back and started talking about the totality of relations, as though United Ireland was just around the corner. She really took the hump at that. But she nonetheless knuckled down and got to work with Garrett Fitzgerald. And what was interesting about this was that the work was done by London civil servants around the Cabinet Office and Dublin civil servants in Foreign Affairs and the Department of the Taoiseach. The NIO was bypassed, and that may be part of the reason that Jim Monroe, as you say, then the leader of unionism, was completely blindsided on this. He thought there was nothing happening. People said, these guys are all talking to you, so there's something going on. He assured people there was nothing going on, that he had received assurances, and so on. And of course, there was plenty going on. And so for the first time, this historic agreement, which in my view has paved the way for all the substantive agreements, was done. And it was a triumph for the Irish civil service. Incidentally, and there are lessons for today. Incidentally, the Irish Civil Service and the then Permanent Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Noel Dorr, was at this conference, and he said he did hundreds of meetings in GB in advance of this with individual MPs, Tories, all the rest of it, to prepare them so that there wouldn't, if there was an agreement, there wouldn't be a backlash in GB. And that's really heavy-duty professional diplomatic work, and it reminds me of what they did again in the run-up to Brexit. They saw the problem coming with Brexit, and that's why when Europe first opened the conversation about the future relationship with a UK that has left Europe, they said, three conditions before we talk to you about anything. You pay your bill, you give us guarantees about EU citizens living in the UK, and no border whatsoever on the island of Ireland. And that was done again. Another diplomatic triumph for Dublin. Their civil servants have really outperformed everyone else over the last few decades.
And the interesting thing about, obviously, the other thing about, I mean, there's so many different facets to, because a lot of things, we tend to focus on unionism in terms of the impact, but a lot's going on with the nationalism at this time, because Sinn Féin are now contesting elections in Northern Ireland by 1985. They contested the local elections, and they actually did surprisingly well. And I think that was another driving factor for, particularly for the Irish government, in going, jeepers, because the Bobby Sands by-election happened, and then Sinn Féin polled a respectable showing in the local government elections as well, and there was a need to kind of bolster the SDLP there as well. Michael, were you? And I appreciate you weren't active in the SDLP at the time, but as a Northern nationalist sitting from Dublin watching this, was that something that was maybe concerning you from your wing of nationalism about the strength of Sinn Féin?
I mean, if we're honest about it, Sinn Féin were starting to climb all over the SDLP at this point. But John Hume, he had a few aces up his sleeve. He persuaded Garret Fitzgerald to convene that New Ireland Forum, the one that Mrs. Thatcher ultimately rejected. But he also persuaded America to get involved, and he persuaded the Department of Foreign Affairs to really lobby hard on Capitol Hill. So this agreement came about. Again, as I said, the Irish had very little of a hand to play, but they had American support for it via John Hume. The Forum didn't rescue the SDLP. The Anglo-Irish agreement didn't. The Sinn Féin trend of gaining against the SDLP continued, but it did. It was an historic breakthrough in terms of moving ahead on the future of Northern Ireland.
I mean, Tim, obviously within unionism, right? So I mean, Michael's talked about Jim Molyneux there. Jim Molyneux was, again, I don't want to say a do-nothing unionist, but he was certainly a sit-back unionist leader. Like, he wasn't an activist. And again, it doesn't happen later, but there is one unionist politician making notes during, in fact, two unionist politicians making notes at this time. There was David Trimble, one, and there's another one, Peter Robinson, as well. We're going to talk about him a little bit later in the podcast, about the unionism really needs to rethink its strategy here after this agreement is done, because the by-elections happen and they don't do anything. Unionism loses one seat and they just hang on to another. Eddie McGrady comes back the following year to take out Enoch Powell. But do you look back now and think that was the moment where unionism goes, we need an internal settlement in Northern Ireland here? Is that, do you look back at that and think that?
Well, before we answer, Michael, I think, is going to take you to task on Eddie McGrady in South Down there. He raised his hand. What?
No, it wasn't that.
No, okay. Seamus Mallon, by the way, just for the electoral nerd, Seamus Mallon comes an MP for the first time in these by-elections, winning Uri Armagh. Eddie McGrady narrowly loses to Enoch Powell. Very, very narrowly, and then in the 87 election comes and wins the seat.
And of course, just you were saying about Sinn Féin that started fighting elections again, and you neglected to say that in Gerry Adams was MP for Belfast West at that time. He won a B83, took over from the SDLP, although Gerry Fitt had stepped aside, and he was Lord Fitt by that time.
I was going to make a point about the opposition to the Anglo-Irish agreement, and it was a point made by Dick Spring, which was there was very little for unions to latch onto. Whereas in Sunningdale, there was a government to bring down up in Stormont. You could march on it. You could, attack all its members. You could go after everybody. With the Anglo-Irish agreement, it was an intergovernmental agreement. And apart from a few officials buried in offices near an army base out the Hollywood Road, there wasn't very much for Paisley to latch onto. He tried to latch onto Mrs. Thatcher now and again when she arrived in Northern Ireland on a visit. But one of the things that gave the Anglo-Irish agreement staying power was simply that there was nothing you could really bring down.
Yeah. Right. Tim?
Well, and I think to answer your question, David, it certainly changed unionist tactics, I think, after the Anglo-Irish agreement, certainly for Peter Robinson, I think critically observing that, he could see that the tactics of protest in this way, of bringing mass amounts of people on the street, and of course, there are other things happening in and around that time, and Peter was obviously involved in some stuff in and around the border town of Clontibret and all of that, and I think Peter had slowly come to the conclusion over the 2 or 3 years post Anglo-Irish agreement that unionism just couldn't protest, couldn't operate in the same way as it had done in the 1970s. Just bringing Northern Ireland to a standstill wasn't going to work. It hadn't really worked in the 1970s, and certainly wasn't going to work in that post Anglo-Irish agreement atmosphere. And I think certainly then we see that he and others, David Trimble being another one, Harold McCusker, of course, being another one, started to see that there has to be maybe a different way for unionism. So I think maybe things that Peter Robinson and others were saying, and we certainly saw with David Trimble and Harold McCusker, were certainly different to in public. What they're saying in public was certainly different to maybe the discussions that they were having in private.
Yep. Because we forget at this time, I mean, we accept power sharing as the norm now, but this was the unionist parties in particular were not in favour of power sharing. They were they were quite sceptical of a power sharing arrangement, even with the SDLP. There was a scepticism there amongst a whole part of unionism about that. There was a sense of, we're going to have a devolved government, let's make it a majority government, which ironically we talk a lot about now. But kind of the Good Friday Agreement norms were not well established at that point as well. Do you think, though, looking back in terms of this here, Michael, that you were talking there about how we make agreements, right? And the Irish government, how they played a strong hand. Mm-hmm. Margaret Thatcher had always styled herself as a unionist, and she had always said, Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley, the famous statements as well. And Margaret Thatcher was a unionist dream in terms of how she dealt with the hunger strikers, that kind of criminalisation approach toward Northern Ireland that she took. I mean, certainly for mainstream unionism, that was something that was incredibly welcomed. Yeah. Why do you think, what ultimately got her over the line, in your opinion, on this?
I think it was security. But I think she bought the argument. The Irish government talked about the nationalist nightmare. David Trimble later talked about the cold house and so on. And I think she bought the argument that there was a legitimate Southern Irish interest in Northern Ireland, even at a cultural, at a grassroots popular level, as opposed to political constitutional. She was a staunch unionist. She remained a staunch unionist. And even after the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed, there wasn't a terrible improvement in the security situation. Yeah. And I think she later regretted even that she'd done the deal. But Margaret Thatcher, who is reviled by everyone in Northern Ireland, except perhaps to an extent myself, was a pragmatist. And she was a problem solver. If you look at the things she did in GB, it was about gripping problems and trying to solve them. So that's where she was on Northern Ireland. I should say there was a mood of optimism in Dublin at the time, and when it was signed, I remember punching the air when Mallon got elected. And I also remember watching Ian Paisley's ferocious never, 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 and me thinking at the time, what he really means is not now, but perhaps later.
and look what happened 20 plus years later with Ian Paisley.
I think for just kind of on Margaret Thatcher, I mean, we've heard even this week that the confirmation that the Anglo-Irish Agreement was the one thing of profound regret that she had, and I think it's very clear that she was oversold what this agreement was going to do. I think probably negotiations happened in the backdrop, obviously, the Conservative Party being attacked by the IRA the year before in the Brighton bombing. And, certainly I think it was able to be sold to Margaret Thatcher in that context of this is going to end and stop violence. And I think she believed her civil servants who said that, and that trend turned out not to be true. And of course, not everybody in the Conservative Party, bought this line, hook, line and sinker. Of course, Ian Gow resigned from the cabinet at the time in response to this. And, there wasn't universal acceptance in GB that this was the right way to go. There were rumblings in the Conservative Party, Ian Gow, Norma Tebbit and others, who were not altogether happy with what had happened. But I think certainly this was sold to Margaret Thatcher on the basis that this was going to end violence and going to end any problems in Northern Ireland. And I think she was completely shocked by the unionist reaction. And then you've mentioned James Molyneux. it's astounding to think that just days before the signed, Jim Mullen was out saying, "Oh, there's nothing to see here. There's going to be no agreement." Anybody who's saying that, is not in the loop, and he was completely out of the loop. He was completely and utterly clueless as to what was going on, which really just typified, I think, James Mullen's tenure as the leader of unionism. It was an inept period of time. It's shocking to me that he survived for so long as unionist leader, someone who was so pathetic in the role, someone who was just, someone who did not have the ability or the charisma to carry unionism. And then, of course, Peter Robinson, I mean, I think he, then in 1987, obviously the task force report that came out from people who were observing from afar, what could the alternatives be to the Anglo-Irish agreement? And then the summer of 1987, that report came out, and it was universally rejected by the leadership. Ian Paisley and James Mullen both rejected that report. That led to Peter
for our listeners, Tim, what was the task force report? What was in it? So
it was the Unionist Task Force report. It was basically, what we were talking about a few moments ago. Peter Robinson and others had looked at this and said, look, we're not going to get what we want. But if we can't get what we want, how can we get what would be at least a position that would be something that would be more advantageous to unionists? We're not going to see this agreement being scrapped, but is there a way that we can change it, navigate through it, get the British government on our side to navigate a different way? And, I think there was a position that was taken by Ian Paisley at the time that it's basically the agreement scrapped or there's no alternative. It's a little bit like the Irish sea border, there's those purists who say it's no sea border at all, no other way. You cannot, these people, Councillor David Clark is forever on my timeline on X, basically saying it's the sea border is there or it's not. There's no other way forward. And I think at the time there were purists like that in relation to the Anglo-Irish agreement. Peter Robinson tried to propose another way. We've never seen the full task force report. We've only seen a condensed version, a summary of the report. And he resigned as deputy leader of the DUP at the time. And look, unionism could have taken a whole different track because he then would step forward to stand a few months later for deputy leadership of the party again. And William McCrae stood against him. And it depends who you believe in this. I've heard 5, 6, 7 different stories. Did he win by 1 vote, 2 votes, 5 votes? Did he win in the landslide? I don't know. But the most popular story is that he won by 1 or 2 votes. What would unionism have been if that had been the other way around? But I don't know what the truth of that story is, because I've heard about 5 or 6 different versions of it.
So just in terms of, obviously, and we'll move on to some other topics in a wee bit, but obviously I always think in these agreements you always do see the interest and the kind of the funny stories that come from it. So in Gareth Fitzgerald's memoir, he reflects talking to Margaret Thatcher after the agreement about, let's get some economic package together for Northern Ireland, and she reacted with horror to this. She basically said something along the lines of, "Look at their roads, look at their schools. Are you mad?" Does that not make your unionist, your red, white, and blue unionist blood boil, Tim? Maybe she wasn't. Maybe because Gareth Fitzgerald reflected later that Margaret Thatcher wasn't really a unionist. She was more of an English nationalist. Really, she wasn't really a British unionist. Do you think that's fair?
I don't know. There's some story, you've just sparked from a memory of her driving down the M1, and they're about to pay the money to have a duel the whole way to Enniskillen, and she's like trying out the bit. At that point in time, you got to the roundabout at the end of the M1, the roundabout I've forgotten now, and basically Ballygolly roundabout, and she didn't see a car from Ballygolly to Enniskillen, and immediately withdrew the funding. I don't know if that story's true, but certainly it was swirling around at the time. I think with Margaret Thatcher, she was a lot more complicated than just a straightforward unionist politician. I think even within Thatcherism, I don't think it's just as straightforward as to say this is exactly what the principles were of Thatcherism economically. She is much more complex character than really sort of pigeonholing her into a box. I do think she was a very strong unionist. I think that is beyond doubt. But I think she was also a pragmatist as well. I think that she she really did believe that Northern Ireland should be as British as Finchley insofar as, Northern Irish politicians shouldn't be coming with begging bowls for more money that people in other parts of England that needed the same investment weren't getting. She wanted to see everybody have the same opportunity, and she wanted to see everybody get the same from the British government to facilitate that equality of opportunity. And I think that's probably more why she would bristle at funding packages from Northern Ireland, not because she lacked unionism, but because I think she wanted to see everybody have that equality of opportunity through the UK.
Yeah, the other rascal who should be mentioned in all of this was Charles Haughey. Voted against it, etc., and led his party against it, simply because it wasn't his agreement. It was a Fine Gael Labour agreement, and Fianna Fáil just rather cynically voted against it. He even harangued Fitzgerald, who apparently had a breakthrough moment with Thatcher, when he cadged. They were both at a funeral of a national leader in the Far East, and the UK had its government jet, and Fitzgerald cadged the lift back on it with Thatcher, and apparently spent 5 hours talking to Thatcher, and you can imagine that would be 4.5 hours of Garrett talking and half an hour of her talking. But anyway, apparently that's where they kind of built the relationship. And of course, when he landed back, Haughey slagged him off for letting Ireland down by begging for a lift.
And he sent Brian Lenihan to America to oppose the agreement as well, to lobby Irish America against it. But then I think talking about regrets, Haughey went the opposite way. I think they talk about that he regretted his opposition to the agreement, and I think Martin Manser, who was his northern advisor, said that they had misread the Anglo-Irish agreement, and their opposition to it was a mistake. But it's interesting, a really fascinating time about that. It'd be interesting to see if any...
Maybe the last time, I was just going to say, maybe the last time we had full unionist unity, because of course for the general election in '87, both unionist parties issued a joint manifesto.
But one of the things, I think it's probably the last time we've had a mass political rally in Northern Ireland. I don't think anyone could fill from the steps of City Hall down to the end of Royal Avenue. I don't think any political issue could. I don't think you would ever get those numbers again for anything.
Not even kneecap.
Not even, no, I'm talking about for a political... I mean, even the Irish language...
Clinton? How many did he get out
even,
for Christmas lights?
Even the Irish language protest did fill up nearly half of City Hall, but I'm talking about, like, this protest went from the top of City Hall right the way down to the bottom. I'm just not sure that those eras are gone, I think, probably in politics.
I think certainly, it was about... I mean, is it going to be close to 200,000? I think the idea that it was 500,000, I think that just... I just don't think that's true.
But it was in years to, like, Solemn League and Covenant type stuff.
No, but 200,000 people at that time, Northern Ireland's population about 1.5 million, say, 900,000 were unionists. I mean, 1 in 5, 1 in 4 unionists were there. I mean, you're never going to see that again.
It is, and we should note the Poor Alliance Party, who, to be fair to them, they were a pro-union party back then. They actually supported the Anglo-Irish agreement, which was a brave thing to do.
And didn't they stood in the by-elections as well, didn't they?
I think they did, yeah. So, but that wasn't for the constituency they had at that time. I think that was we should know political bravery whenever we see, because canvassing for this within unionism was not a popular thing to do. So, to be fair to them as well. Right, okay, gents, we'll move on to our next topic. Welcome back to the Stormont Sources podcast. We are on to look at leadership challenges and resignations. This time 10 years ago, it was in this week, that quite a lot was happening in Northern Ireland politics. So a few days ago, we're marking it, the 10-year anniversary of Colm Eastwood ousting Alistair MacDonald as the SDLP leader. This is the first time ever that a Northern Ireland Party leader had been voted out of office by his or her political party. So quite historic. And of course, our own Michael was the special advisor in the SDLP at that time. He had a front row seat to this. And then a few days later, not that Colm Eastwood was able to enjoy the limelight for that long, because then Peter Robinson, a few days later, announces that he is standing down as the leader of the DUP, and so begins the DUP melodrama, the leadership there, where we all thought Nigel Dodds was coming in, and then of course we end up Arlene Foster. Well, we're going to unpack all that for you, and of course our own Timothy was still around as a special advisor in the DUP at that time. I was at both Arlene Foster's coronation in the Park Avenue Hotel and the SDLP conference, which was held in Armagh. Remains to this day the funnest party conference I've ever been at in my life. So, Michael, thank you for putting on a show for me. Okay, I'm going to start first with the Alistair MacDonald Colm Eastwood leadership. Alistair MacDonald's leadership had been under threat for a while. There have been rumblings about a leadership challenge. Of course, earlier that year, Mark Durkan, a former SDLP leader and MP, had come out publicly and said that that Alistair MacDonald should stand down as party leader. And then over the summer, things get moving in 2015, and Colm Eastwood announces he will challenge for the leadership. And basically all the old guard of the SDLP line up against Alistair MacDonald, from Seamus Milne right the way through. Michael, what was it like working in the SDLP at that time? It must have been pretty... So what was it like? And then two, who were you backing in the leadership contest?
Well, those were interesting times, without a doubt. Part of the problem, the SDLP constitution provides for the re-election of the leader every year at conference. So there's a potential contest for leader, deputy leader all the time. But essentially what it boiled down to was, you've got to remember there's a background here of electoral decline. If they were winning elections, these tensions wouldn't exist. But they were losing elections, and two schools of thought emerged. One, we need to organise better. Sinn Féin are much better at organisation. We need to do more on the ground. Or two, we don't have a strategy. We don't have what are we actually presenting to people as our offering? So those two schools of thought, Alistair was very much, we need to organise, we need to knock more doors, produce more leaflets. And he did brilliantly himself, the way he organised his way to winning South Belfast, a strongly safe unionist seat. And he said he would do it before he did it, and amazingly he held on to it as well. But anyway, he was saying that's the answer, where others were saying, no, we need a strategy, we need policy. All we've got at the moment is defend the Good Friday Agreement, which isn't really that attractive a strategy, and led to electoral errors Tim has mentioned before, like stop the DUP campaigns and things like that, which didn't help at all. So I think people were railing against Alistair that he didn't have a strategy, didn't have any policies, and just thought licking the stamps faster was going to recover the position. Nobody believed that. So that was the background to it. Colm Eastwood came along. If you remember, Peter Robinson created these roles of assembly private secretaries, which were like junior ministers with no power whatsoever, but they could go to meetings and so on. And Eastwood became our assembly private secretary, and he began to make an impression with people who didn't know him that well, that he was, he was bright. He had clear beliefs and principles. He could articulate them. And he was ambitious, and ultimately he was game. And when it was suggested to him that he might be interested in leadership, he decided he would go for it. And the party divided between largely people who, I think a majority who wanted change because the current trend was going nowhere, and a very substantial proportion of the party who supported Alistair. But his support was almost personal, as opposed to ideological or based on anything particularly tangible, other than they liked Alistair, who was a great organiser himself, a very generous man with his time and resources, and a big, strong personality. And but I always thought that the majority lay there for change. So even though I was an employee, I suppose, of the party, yes, I very much supported the change, but and helped Colm with his campaign. I was glad he won, but I took no.
We're just going to walk past that, Michael. We're just go. How did you help him? Because funny, the first time I ever heard your name, Michael, was actually at the SDLP leadership conference, and people pointed. They pointed out a couple of people, but your name was one of the ones that came up about one of the people who had helped rustle the numbers for Colm to oust Alistair. So can you just, without breaking...
Well, I had a bit of experience of this when Margaret Ritchie got elected leader. She defeated Alistair. So I was never on Alistair's Christmas card list, but That's not to say I didn't admire many aspects of him, but basically we formed a committee to back Colm, and you just go through the hard slog. You know who the party members are, you know who the delegates are likely to be, you know where the numbers lie, you know the branches with the big delegate strength, you know the ones that aren't worth chasing. We had everybody in the party categorised between, you know, strongly for, slightly for, don't know, and the hopeless ones that were very loyal to Alistair. We didn't waste any time in it, but we ran that and we just went through the list and worked it and put Colm in front of people.
And I'll bring Tim in a second, but I just wonder, because I mean, the heavyweights of the party that were coming out and back in Eastwood, like Seamus Mallon back in Eastwood, you had Carmel Hanna, I think nearly every former SDLP minister from the 99 executive onwards was back in Eastwood. Nearly all the MLAs were back in Eastwood at the time as well.
And
so
a lot of young people as well would have favoured.
Well, why then? I mean, looking at that, why did no one turn around to Alistair and say, Alistair, you've literally got nearly every main elected representative in this party against you. Why did no one say? Why did he not get that message?
Alistair was a brilliant campaigner within the party. He had brought a lot of the new people into the party. I mean, people were personally loyal to him, and he was a great organizer, and he was a big gregarious man that a lot of people felt strong personal allegiance to. The rest of the party were thinking, we're not going anywhere and we need change. And then also over the years, I suppose, various MLAs and leading figures in the party have maybe been rubbed up the wrong way by Alistair over the years, because Alistair liked to, as well as being hugely successful in his own career, and his own electability, he liked to support people in different areas around the north, and that caused friction here and there, and maybe some people were paying him back a bit for that.
And of course, the one of the main families he rivaled with is now runs the party, Clara Hanna. The Hannah, the battles with her mum, Carmel Hanna, between her and Alistair MacDonald in South Belfast were legendary. Tim, just the DUP, were you guys looking at this, and was this did this register at all within the DUP? And I can see you shaking your head, by the way. Were you guys paying any attention and to what was going on?
Not really, no. I mean, the only time I think we ever paid any significant attention to the SDLP leadership was in the aftermath of Alistair being elected, and the whole, these lights are blinding me. I mean, I just remember just thinking that was very funny. When he left, I mean, he was never someone who really made a dent. He was really someone who, from a unionist perspective, where I was thinking, this is a person who's taken a party places. I mean, the very best you could say about him, he was a maintainer, maybe. He certainly wasn't going to be someone who was going to lead things forward. Colm Eastwood, I mean, certainly from a unionist perspective, I don't think anybody was fearful of Colm or what he was going to do. And how it turned out, Colm Eastwood turned out he was very good on TV, prodigious debater in the televised debates. He was probably the best of his era in that, but you know, he didn't really lay a glove anywhere, did he?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, Michael. Was it, looking back 10 years, and obviously, look, knowing what we know now and all that sort of stuff, you can only make decisions with the information you have at the time. Do you think it was worth? I mean, because Colm, I suppose, he didn't really arrest the decline at all, did he? I mean, the SDLP had 14 MLAs when he did it, 3 MPs. It's now got 8 MLAs and 2 MPs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, he didn't. But I mean, it's a tall order to do that once you're on that kind of trajectory. It's not easy to do. I should say that Alistair, I also thought, you know, he sort of divided people. If you weren't his friend and loyal, then he didn't really want to know you very much. And in my case, you know, I was there as the party's advisor. He didn't use me at all once he became leader, and he surrounded himself by other people. And that's how he had things like the lights going on. And, you know, it just wasn't all that sharp an operation. And in fact, when I look back on it, the fact that he didn't use me, he probably should have fired me. Or I should probably have resigned. But anyway, so I wasn't there to do any harm. But I must say, Alistair made a tremendous contribution to the party. And I should say, like, we go from Hume and Mallon and elevating them, and then we talk about Clare and Eastwood and Matthew and so on as the bright young generation. But the people in between, the Mark Durkins, Margaret Ritchies and Alistair MacDonald, deserve enormous credit, because through very difficult years, they fought the good fight, and they led democratic nationalism.
Yeah,
And I think it's fair to say, you know, that generation, if you want to call it the in-between generation, did a lot more to, I don't want to say friendly is not the right word, but did a lot more to at least be on cordial relations with unionists than certainly what the people who came after them did. And I think that was certainly a big difference between Colm Eastwood and Alistair MacDonald before him. Was it almost seemed at times Colm Eastwood just really wanted to deliberately poke the bear, to just, you know, say something just outrageous, just to provoke a reaction and almost to be relevant. And, you know, it felt like needless. And I certainly don't think Margaret Ritchie would have done that, and I don't think Alistair would have done that either.
I'm not too sure, though, because to be fair to Colm, this is November 2015. Within 9 months, we've got Brexit on there, right? I'm not sure any nationalist leader could have responded in any other way.
I'm not saying, but I'm not talking about, you know, there just felt like these sort of needless Twitter posts, these needless little barbs that were said almost to generate column inches to try and look relevant. And I don't think, certainly that some of the people who came before him as leader of the party, I don't think they would have done that. Now, of course, they would have led, you know, had they been leader at Brexit, they would have led the charge against Brexit, but I don't think they would have done these sort of little needless digs at unionism. It's just,
the final thing,
childish, really.
The final thing I should say about Al is that even though I think he's taken a bit of a backseat now, he has left the legacy in that at least 2 members of his family, 2 of his sons, are very active in the SDLP, and from what I hear, they're a credit to him.
And what are they doing? I'm sorry,
they're
councillors?
active in
they're in
the local organisation.
So maybe future leaders.
I hope they're not. Fighting with Clare.
If they've some of the old DNA,
maybe revenge as a ditch best.
No, these fellas are above all that.
So another big moment, and again, we can't do the podcast without talking about this. Obviously, a few days later, Peter Robinson, I mean, look, it wasn't really a shock when Peter Robinson did it. Peter Robinson had been speculating for a while that he would go at that in some point during the 2011 to 16 mandate, and we were coming up. People forget there was an assembly election in the May of 2016. We knew an EU referendum was going to be held in the near future by the end of 2015 as well. Tim, whenever Peter came in and told you all, right, guys, this is it, I'm off, what was the response? Were you shocked when he announced it at the timing, or were you fully expecting it?
I mean, everybody knew he was going at some point before the 2016 election. I think it was today, as we record, 10 years ago that he made the announcement, and then the conference was coming up in just a few days. I mean, it was either going to be at the party conference, or, you know, as he did in the end, where he did a sort of media round and announced that he was going in advance of the conference, because I think he sort of didn't really want the conference to be a big shock moment for people. He wanted people to be warned in advance. But like everybody knew, I don't think his health was a factor in him going, because I think he was going anyway. But obviously he had some ill health earlier on that year. But it was widely known. I mean, it was no secret, and he never made it any secret that he was not going to be running for election in the 2016 Assembly election. So in November 2015, when the announcement came, it was no shock at all. What was a shock, of course, is then what followed that, and that was a big shock. And I was shocked on the weekend when I found out that Nigel Dodds was withdrawing his name as leader.
So Nigel, just for some of our younger listeners, and Nigel, when Peter Robinson stepped down, Nigel Dodds, of course, was the deputy leader. Everyone thought that he was going to come in and Arlene Foster would be the First Minister. Why? Because the DUP had looked at how Sinn Féin had done these things, and and thought basically, well, we'll take a page from their book. It seems to work for them. So you would have had Nigel Dodds as the leader. I'm assuming Arlene would have been the deputy leader and the first minister, and that would have been how it would have went. But then to everyone's shock, because at that party conference, which again, people are just going to think I hang around party conferences, but at that DUP conference, everyone was talking about Nigel. Like, delegates were walking up to get pictures with Nigel, more so than usual.
He was the bookie's favourite.
Yeah, more so than usual, because everyone thought he was going to be the next leader. And what do you think shaped? Because the DUP were untouchable at this time. This is 2015. DUP are at the peak of their powers. Why would he not want to be the leader of the largest unionist party and basically gifted over to Arlene?
I don't know. I think I can only speculate, and I don't. I probably don't want to speculate too much on that right now. But I think for Nigel, I do think he felt some pressure in and around his seat. I mean, it was starting to be clear that, you know, this was not a unionist seat forever and a day any longer. And I think I think he would have worried that would he become the focus of a Republican takedown. You know, if you want to take out the leader of unionism, that certainly puts a focus and a fire on that seat. I think there's certainly that in the background, because that's really what happened in the end. Nigel became a sort of bellwether for Brexit because of all that happened in and around the confidence in supply and all of that. Nigel became this bellwether figure for republicanism, and I think there was probably, you know, something in that in the background. He just didn't want to have this focus on him. I think also he kind of reflected it doesn't really work to have the leader of unionism in Westminster and the leader of the executive then in Belfast. And I think he wisely reflected that that's just not something that can really work. And I think we see right now with Gavin, with Emma Littlepin-Gilly, it doesn't really work. Gavin needs to come back and be the leader of unionism from Stormont, because you just don't get that critical engagement with all of the people in Northern Ireland if you're in Westminster. Westminster is almost irrelevant to our day-to-day lives, and I think we see that now. So I think Nigel's instincts were right, that for him to have been the leader in Westminster, for Arlene to have been here, didn't quite work. However, I would say I think it's a source of regret for me that didn't happen, because I don't think unionism would have declined so much under Arlene Foster had that more steadying, more I think, you know, Arlene Foster fluctuated too much. Her temperament was not suited to leadership. She was either, you know, outrageously outgoing, work in a room, everybody loved her, or she was angry and bristling. Those were the two Arlenes: work in a room well, or bristly Arlene. Nigel is very much, he's rock solid. You don't, you know, and all the time I've known Nigel Dodds, he's only ever been angry at me once. And that's, and I'll tell you, here's
that's a low number.
Well, I'll tell you something, and I'll tell you something, this will be shocking for people who are involved in politics. After he was angry at me, it was in an election meeting, and I've made some smart ass comment, as I do, and Nigel had reacted rightly, to take me to task for it. And afterwards, and this is a mark of the man, because not many politicians would do this. He came to me and said, "Look, sorry about that, temper's boiled over." Now, for him to do that, you would have expected with me go to him and say, "I'm really sorry about it," and he would graciously accept my apology, because I was the young Turk being a bit rude in a meeting, making a smart-ass comment. But he came to me, and that's the mark of Nigel. He was very much even-keeled. He is even-keeled. Nice guy. He is genuinely a nice guy. He's a nice guy all the time. And I think that sort of more even temperament would have been better through the volatile years of Brexit, through the volatile years of RHI, for him to have been that sort of steadying hand at the top, I think is what unionism needed. Unfortunately, Arlene, with her volatile character, was what unionism had. And unfortunately, I think that was the unionism's detriment.
And I, by the way, echo what you said about Nigel. Was always very, even knew I was a constituent of his, and knew I wouldn't have been a natural supporter, but was always a gentleman to me, and was always incredibly respectful as well.
And still is in the House of Lords. We're talking about him as if he's no longer.
We're talking about him. I know.
Very much involved, and very much the same. And anytime I see Nigel, he's such a friendly guy and such a super nice guy.
But so what is? And I'll ask you both this question. So the Robinson legacy, then, because there was a bit. I think it was Newton Emerson wrote a column. You'll miss him when he's gone. And I don't think people, because then what happened was Arlene came in. Arlene had a surge of we forget the first 9-10 months of Arlene's leadership. She was incredibly popular, and people thought this was the next. There was almost like a sigh of relief in the DUP. I remember when she did become the leader, and there were a group of duppers sitting outside, and I remember just talking to them off the record, and I remember asking, "What do you think?" And they were like, "Relief." It was just like, We've moved on to our new leader, and Arlene will be a different face of the DUP. That Peter kind of run his race. Wasn't a hostility to Peter, just that he had run his race. What do you think, Michael, when we think of the Robinson years?
I think that he didn't leave the legacy that he maybe could have left. I was puzzled, and I'm still puzzled, as to why he left, if it wasn't health reasons. And he didn't go to the House of Lords subsequently either. I agree with what Tim said. I think Nigel Dodds was a more gifted all-round politician than Arlene, even though that initial splurge, Arlene's 5-point plan and all of that was very popular and did very well for the DUP. But I think Robinson, I think you mentioned one time, Tim, that he's the last of the big beasts. And I think he's the one unionist who could possibly have united unionism. He was hard enough to operate on the TUV side of things, and pragmatic enough to work on the other side. And I don't think he achieved his potential. And he did things. He did the odd liberal thing. I mean, he was the first guy to go to Catholic Mass, the funeral of policeman Ronan Kerr, Catholic policeman who was murdered, and so on. And he often said that he wished that Unionists, or Protestants, inverted commas, had something like the GAA, which would give them, there was a version of that, because he recognised the strength it had in communities. And the other thing I'll say, and I never got the chance to say this to him personally, although I'd intended to pick my moment at some point, and this is a world exclusive. But you mentioned Peter's, when he was a bit more of a rascal and less of a statesman, he did that raid on Clontibret. And a couple of years before that, I had married a girl from Roscommon, and her name was Catherine Kennellan. And her uncle was Justice Peter Kennellan, who jailed Robbo. And I later asked him, in the bar that he owned in Roscommon, which was never bothered very much by the police late at night, I asked him about it, and he just said, a blackguard, I tell you. He's gone from us now, but anyway, I thought I'd share that.
It's a small world.
Just on Peter Robinson, you said, why did you think he just left and walked off the stage? I think, because he had mentioned something in and around this a few times over the years when I knew him, and I think he was very conscious that he was left as deputy leader for a long time, even though he was de facto leader for quite a large amount of that period where he was deputy leader. He was left as deputy leader, and he was left a little bit encumbered by Ian Paisley hanging on, and I think he didn't want that to happen for anybody else, and I think that's why he's
28 years.
And also, it is worth noting, we did get the Stormont House agreement just before he announced his resignation.
Well, he felt he had left things in a good place with the Stormont House agreement. Unionism was on the up. He felt it was primed for a really good election in 2016, which is what subsequently happened. And I think deep down, underlying all of that was he didn't want to be a backseat driver. He didn't want to be someone who would be a distraction to the new leadership, and that's why he left and got off the pitch, because I think he was very acutely aware that people hang around too long. It stops the next generation. It held things back in unionism, and he just didn't want to do that. And he'd said that to me certainly a couple of times, that was his intention. When he went, he was going.
And of course, in 2014, Ian Paisley did come back with that sit-down interview where he returned the serve on Peter Robinson. Wasn't a particularly pleasant time, I'm sure, in the DUP, but we'll unpack that at some future. Gents, I really enjoyed this, by the way. I love this trip down memory lane. I hope our listeners enjoyed it too, and two people who had front row seats to most of this as well makes it all the better. And just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with us about anything you've heard on this podcast, you can send us a WhatsApp 0333 404 6507. Just use the word Stormont so we know it's for this podcast. You can also send us an email, hello@stormontsources.com. Thank you so much for listening to us on this podcast. Thanks from Michael, Tim and myself, and we'll see you next week.